In this video, I'm going to be talking about some interview tips that will help increase the value of your videos without costing you anything, except for the final tip, which is more of a bonus tip and it doesn't really cost you much anyway, but anyway, here's the story. As we all know as video producers, interviews are the backbone to a lot of the videos that we create. A lot of the time, when you have a good interview, you'll end up having a good video. But if you have a bad interview, it makes a good video become a lot harder to produce. Sometimes interviews can be salvaged, and with some creative editing, you can make the video as good as you possibly can. But when you start with bad ingredients, you end up having a bad meal. So from my experience, I would always suggest trying to get the best interview possible. So without spending thousands of dollars on new lights or cameras or lenses, how can you level up your videos in terms of interviews? Well, here are a few tips. The very first thing that I would suggest when you are interviewing someone is try to make them as comfortable as possible. When people walk into a room, and I've seen this time and time again, and they're walking into a room that has lights set up, a big camera setup, maybe multiple people, audio, all that kind of stuff, it can be quite daunting to them. For some people, the extent of their video experience is just recording with their smartphone in the privacy of their own home or office. But when they walk into a room where there's lots of equipment set up and lots of people, it does put them in a somewhat vulnerable situation. And for some people, that can create a lot of anxiety. But we don't want that with our interviews. We want our interviewees to feel relaxed, comfortable, and be able to do the best that they can in front of the camera. So I always try to make sure that the people that I'm interviewing know what to expect. They aren't just walking into a room blind and not knowing what the process is going to be. They know what questions are going to be asked. They know what to expect. They know that there's going to be a camera, there's going to be audio, and there's going to be lighting, and it's not just a smartphone that's going to be recorded. They know what they're walking into and they know what is to be expected from them. And if they do walk into the room and they say that they're just going to wing it and that they haven't prepared, well, that can be a little bit annoying to me when I hear that. But a lot of the time, the people that are being interviewed for these videos are quite busy and they might not necessarily have a lot of time to prepare for these types of projects. So I do try to extend a bit of grace in that regard. And if they do wing it and they walk in without being prepared, then hopefully they can give their best performance. But there have been times in the past where people have just walked into the room, said that they're going to wing it, and they did not wing it. And then we weren't either able to use what they said, or we just had to spend a lot of time trying to get the sound bites out of them, trying to get the grabs, the things that we want in our video to be able to put together something that was of value, as opposed to just recording once with them, winging it, saying lots of ums and ahs, and we'll get to that later in this video. But yeah, it's always important for people to be prepared when they walk into the room and know what they are going to say. Otherwise, they're just wasting a lot of people's time, including theirs. I also make sure that the interviewee knows to answer in full sentences. So for example, if I ask them, "What did you have for breakfast this morning?" and they just say toast, well, that's not really a usable answer. What I want to hear is something like, "This morning I had toast and it was delicious." When I give that example to an interviewee, a light bulb goes off in their head, and then it just makes the whole process a lot easier. And it makes the content that we're gathering a lot easier to be able to edit together later. People being interviewed or presenting to camera also do ask, "What do I do with my hands?" And I always suggest to have a resting position. I normally just put my hands like this in front of me, and that's my resting position when I'm standing or sitting. And I find that works quite well. Otherwise, yeah, people can be like, "What do I do with my hands?" And it can be a little bit awkward. We don't want that. We want people to look as comfortable as possible in front of the camera, and having a resting position for people's hands is definitely something I would encourage when interviewing people. It's also important to let them know that we can record this as many times as necessary. I do find though that a lot of clients do use the word authentic a lot, and they don't like the idea of having multiple takes of the interviews. They'll possibly prefer just to have one take of the interview, because if they start doing it again and again and again, it can start to sound not so authentic. However, that does open up a lot of problems in the editing process, because if you do one take and the person being interviewed stumbles a lot, says and ah a lot, then it can make the actual edit quite clunky. And that's where I would suggest to always try to do 2 takes of what you're doing. The first take really is just to get the interviewee comfortable in front of the camera. However, depending on how long this interview is, like if it's going to be a long 1-hour interview with 40 questions, you're not going to do 2 takes. But if you're doing an interview where you're asking maybe 3, 4, or 5 questions, and you've got maybe 15 minutes allotted for the interview, half an hour, whatever, and you get through all those questions quite quickly, I think it is a wise idea to just go over it again and be able to have those 2 takes, because you could possibly edit between the 2 takes depending on how the performance was for each take. If the first one had a lot of ums and ahs, then it's probably not ideal. But then if the second one, because they're a little bit more relaxed, they know what they're saying and they've already done that process just minutes earlier, then it would make sense to be able to use that second take. And more often than not, if I'm getting multiple takes of things, I'm always using the last take, because that's the take that I'm most happy with. And it's really like maybe 1 out of 100 that I'd maybe revert back to the first take, because for whatever reason, the second take wasn't as good. More often than not, the majority of the time, the second take is always the best take. And that also speeds up my editing process as well, knowing to go to the last take of that question or whatever it is that they're doing to camera. If they're using auto cue and talking to a script, pretty much 99% of the time, I'm always going to that second take. And I rarely go more than 2 takes if they're doing a auto cue piece to camera, because normally the person has come prepared, they know the script. The first one's really just a warm up, and then the second one is the real deal. And it's only if they've really struggled on that second one that I might get a third one. But more often than not, I find that 2 takes is more than enough. Very, very rarely would I ever only do 1 take, because in that 1 take, you've got no backup. And if for whatever reason something went wrong in one of the takes, one of the words was missaid or mispronounced, or something that I didn't pick up at the time, and if there was a producer with me as well, they didn't pick up, that would be somewhat catastrophic for the video project. To only have 1 take of that particular script or 1 take of whatever it is that they're presenting camera. So I would always suggest having 2 takes, time dependent. As I said before, if you're doing a 1-hour interview, you're not doing 2 takes, but if you're doing something a bit shorter, definitely do 2 takes. The next thing to consider when doing interviews or pieces to camera is to figure out whether you want them to be looking directly at the lens or off to the side of the camera, talking to someone that's interviewing them like I'm pretending to do right now. For these YouTube videos, obviously I'm looking at the lens, I'm talking directly at the audience, which is you. And I like that for these YouTube videos. It makes sense. It might look a little weird if I was looking off side to the camera doing these YouTube videos. This is very common for corporate videos. However, this isn't a corporate video, this is a YouTube video. So it's always important to consider the audience and the, I guess, genre of the video that you are creating. If you're creating something for YouTube, obviously you want to be looking at the lens. If you're creating a corporate video, then having someone looking directly at the lens can be good, or having them looking offside to the camera could be good as well. It does a lot of the time come down to someone's personal preference. Recently, I was on a shoot and one of the clients or one of the colleagues of the client that I was working with mentioned that they find when people are looking directly at the camera that it can be quite confronting and a little bit awkward for them watching the video, which is perfectly fine feedback and perfectly fine position to hold. However, I don't think that should discount the idea of talking to camera for every single type of video. That's also just one person's opinion, and I think that it is important to be able to take people's feedback in these situations, think about it, and then also address their concerns. So her main concern, and when she said this to me, was that it felt a bit awkward having someone look straight at the camera. That was just her point of view and her opinion. But then I kind of pointed out, well, when we talk to people face to face, we typically look at their eyes, and that's how we have a conversation. And that is what we're doing right now when someone is talking to camera and looking at the lens. We are looking at the other person in the eye and hopefully having some sort of engagement that way. And after I mentioned that and explained that, they kind of, I guess, nodded and said, oh yeah, okay, I understand what you're saying. I guess it's just my personal preference to not have them looking at the camera, and that's perfectly fine as well. So I would suggest that when you are recording interviews or pieces to camera, to double check with the client what kind of style they're going for. Are they wanting that kind of direct talking to the audience look, or are they wanting where they're looking off to the side of the camera and not making that direct contact with the audience like I was just then? And the last thing that I want to address, which is a free tip and doesn't cost you anything, is addressing the problem. When we are interviewing people and they're recounting stories or just giving a testimonial or whatever it may be, it is very common for them to add in ums and ahs. And in the editing process, this can be quite a problem. When you're recording it and in everyday conversation, ums and ahs are quite common, and it's not necessarily something that we really pick up too much unless someone's really peppering ums, ahs, or whatever when we're talking to them. But then when you get into the editing process and you start putting it together, every time you hear an or an ah, it doesn't sound that great, especially in a video that is supposed to sound polished and professional. So I would suggest when you are recording people not to mention ums or ahs unless it starts to become quite a problem. A lot of the time I've found that I'm able to cut out ums and ahs that I don't want to include in the video just by either doing jump cuts, which some clients are okay with and some clients aren't. And if they aren't happy with the jump cuts, then cutting to some sort of B-roll. If there is no B-roll to cut to, then we might start to have a problem. And that's where it is actually quite important to know how these videos are going to be put together that you're filming people doing the interviews or presenting to camera with. If there isn't going to be an option for B-roll, then you're going to have to make sure that the person talking isn't peppering every single sentence with ums and ahs. And I do strongly suggest not to mention ums and ahs unless it is a big problem, because as soon as you mention it, the person that is being interviewed or presenting to camera, once they start saying or ah, they become hyper aware of it, and then they just stop whatever they're saying. And then it starts to make the process of getting the content that you're wanting out of the interviewee or the presenter a lot harder. Let me know in the comments if you have any tips that will help minimize the ahs from people that are being interviewed or presenting to camera. And the last tip I have, which is the bonus tip and does actually cost something, is always have a little pouch that has something like tissues or even some powdered anti-shine as well, or even liquid anti-shine to help make the people that you are interviewing look their best. I found recently on a shoot, just having those tissues available to hand to the person being interviewed to just run across their forehead, across their nose, or whatever, wherever there might be some shininess showing up on the camera. It really does help minimize the shine, and it really does make the interviewee or the presenter look their best in front of the camera. And then when the tissues aren't enough, then I can hand over some anti-shine as well. And I feel that when you show the people being interviewed that you're looking out for them and you want them to look their best, it does relax them a bit more. It does make them feel like they are on a professional set, and they can have confidence that whatever it is that you capture will be of high value and something that they will be happy with. So hopefully you found those tips helpful and you'll be able to use those on future projects. And speaking of projects, I thought I'll just mention how I actually landed some of my recent interview projects. So I don't do a lot of marketing. I don't do a lot of reaching out to local businesses or anything like that. A lot of the projects that come my way are through referrals or just people that are in my network and know that I do video production. So for the last couple of projects that I've done, they were actually through a photographer that I've worked with through an agency that, although he does do video projects, He mainly does photography, and there were a couple of projects that required video that he didn't really want to have to deal with the whole video side of things. It's a lot more simpler for him to focus on the photography, and then I can come in and do the video side of things. So he actually referred me on to the people that were running these events that needed a videographer. And after they touched base with me and found out how much I'd charge and just got an idea of whether I'd be appropriate for the job, they were then able to book me, and then I was able to put them in my calendar and then send an invoice off, and then they paid me ahead of time as well, which was a pleasant surprise because a lot of the video projects that I do, I invoice after I've done them, and then it's another 30 days for them to then pay that invoice. So it was nice having that project paid ahead of time just to help with that cash flow in running a video production company. And that's the video. I hope you found this video helpful, and if you did, please give it a like. And if you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel for more videos on video creation in the future.